Number 5, really, this might surprise a lot of people, but I'm going with Nick Saban. All right. Doesn't have a lot of games against him, really, to be honest. Only 4 games. It looks like they're 2-2. So record was a big deal for me. I'm going to give away my strategy here. Nick's been a tough fight, obviously, each time. I saw both of Deshaun Watson's amazing games. I traveled to those games in person. I didn't see this last year's, and I didn't see the New Orleans one. But honestly, Deshaun, I believe, other than that onside kick, man, he had that game won. I believe that it could easily been this Dabo 3-1 over Nick Saban. I had to put him on here because, man, they have some of the best classic college football games ever when they play each other. Not to mention that Dabo is a Bama grad, which makes it even more exciting when they play each other. But my number 5 was Nick Saban. What you got?
Yeah, number 5 for me is Dave Doran. He did have Clemson on the ropes, should have beat him in Death Valley just a couple of seasons ago. But when you say frustrate, he's frustrated a lot of the Clemson fan base, including this guy right here with his shenanigans about the laptop after the game a couple of seasons ago. They were stealing Kelly Bryant's towels the year before that. And it just seems like every time after they play Clemson that he's upset about something other than the results on the football field. And he makes excuses and does that. And Dabo's even had to kind of come back in press conferences and lay back into Dave Doran a little bit to kind of put him back in check and put him in his place. Dave Doran, number 5 on my list for the reasons I just said.
So my number 4, I think, is another one that's more surprising. Really, I put him as number 4 because in recent history, he hasn't been frustrating really anymore. But I put Jimbo Fisher. For a little while there, man, he just dominated Dabo after he took over the reins. I think won like 3 or 4 in a row against Dabo Swinney in that time period when he first took over the reins, maybe 3 in a row. And yes, 3 straight from 2012, 2014. I got that. But he's overall 4-5, so he's lost a lot of games in the last couple of years. And then he moved over to Texas A&M and lost again, but it was a tough game. I'll give him that. And Dabo's even mentioned, he's like, I can't get rid of Jimbo Fisher. He transfers to a school that's not even in the conference, and I still have to play him. So, Dabo's a little frustrated sometimes too with having to do that. But, Brent Venable, it seems like Jimbo always finds holes in Brent Venable's defenses, and they're either like super high scoring games or really lopsided. It's just weird just how different they are from year to year. But good games, man. That Deshaun Watson game where he like nailed it to Deion Kane late in the game, going down, marching down the field. That was a classic. Hey, on the Florida State side, where they kicked that like 75-yard field goal to win, that was like a heartbreaker. There's a lot of classic games there. So finally, though, this year is it. They probably won't see Texas A&M for 20 years, according to most experts. So this is it for Jimbo Fisher, and I gave him number 4.
Number 4 for me is a coach that is no longer coaching college football, and it is Paul Johnson. If you go back and look at the list, Paul Johnson beat Dabo 4 of the first 5 times that they squared off against one another, including Dabo's first game at home when he became the interim coach. And then, of course, in that ACC title game a couple of years later, which got vacated, by the way, later by Georgia Tech. So technically Clemson won that. We could go back. But for the first 5 times that Paul Johnson played against Dabo, remember, he beat him. And there was a couple of games where they had a ton of trick plays. And then, of course, that disaster down at Grant Field when Deshaun Watson got hurt and we had all the interceptions.
Oh, yeah.
28-6 final. Just the absolute worst. And I know when you look at lately, Brent Venable seemed to solve that offense finally, and Clemson has not, really been tested by them. But I think from a frustration perspective, especially the way they lost a couple of those ball games, Paul Johnson is number 4 on my list.
It's funny you say Paul Johnson number 4. I put him number 3. So we're going to go to number 3 for me. Overall record 4-7. I just remember that ACC championship game with CJ Spiller coming back to seal the deal, to win the ACC. Man, he had like 5,000 yards that game, and they lost. And it was just so heartbreaking to go from the beginning of the season, hearing CJ go on the radio and say, me and Dean talked about it, about how we pulled over in a parking lot to hear CJ tell everybody that he's coming back. And then at the end of the season to lose to Georgia Tech of all teams, the frustrating option. And not only that, I looked, you mentioned that 3 times Dabo went to Atlanta, back to back, Atlanta, and lost. And it was like, what is the problem in Atlanta? And then, even with Brent Venables, he wasn't able to fix it at the beginning. And then it was like a light switch turned on. I think he turned to like of a 4-4 kind of a defense. Instead of sticking to that 4-3, maybe even like a 3-4, he switched up his front seven, and that was like the winner. Or he brought down like an Isaiah Simmons or a Dorian O'Daniel. He made like a 4 linebacker front, and that was the winner for Paul Johnson. It like destroyed him. And then, you never saw any problems with Paul Johnson after that. It was like they just couldn't get to the outside at all for Clemson. And with Dexter Lawrence's of the world, they weren't getting on the inside at all either. So I had Paul Johnson number 3.
I've got Nick Saban number 3. 2-2 record, obviously 4 games. There'll be an ESPN 30 for 30 about this era when we go back. And it looks like Dabo and Nick are actually real good friends as well, and all the tie-ins. But obviously the frustrations of the way they lost that game, you talk about with the onside kick, the frustrations of getting blown out. Blown out might be a little bit unfair, but really being manhandled physically down in New Orleans a couple of seasons ago. I think that's a very frustrating thing. If you think about it, if you take Nick Saban out of this era for Clemson, how many national titles might they have, right? And you could flip the script for Nick also. If there hadn't been this Clemson team sitting there the last 4 years, Nick might be rattling off 4 or 5 in a row at this point, because it's Alabama and Clemson up here and everybody else. And it's been like that now for at least 3, if not 4 of the last 4 seasons. So I have Nick Saban as number 3 on my list of coaches that have frustrated Dabo the most.
Number 2, for me, a lot of people said this was their number 1, but I got a special pick for number 1. I'm holding it. Steve Spurrier. All right. It's like Voldemort. I hate saying that name. The guy that with the Darth Visor, right? But he was actually, I think, 5-1 against Dabo. Dabo, not only could he not seem to really, to me, it was more Connor Shaw. He just couldn't seem to beat Connor Shaw for whatever reason. The guy was just a miracle worker against Clemson. He was very difficult to beat. And you got the 5 bomb, and are we going to get the thumb? And then you got Steve Spurrier just jabbing them in the media, just loving it. And I think those guys, man, they played golf together. So, who knows? Who knows if they hated each other or not? But they definitely played it up for the media, and I loved it. And we all loved it for sure. But the reason why I didn't put Steve Spurrier, I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of ever being a number 1 on my...
Okay. Nice.
But the other thing, I didn't want to give a Gamecock a satisfaction of being number 1 in anything. But I will tell you this. He left when he knew that it was over. Yep. And that, to me, automatic, not number 1. I put Steve Spurrier at number 2. Great record against Dabo. Definitely frustrating, but not worthy of number 1.
Well, now I'm super curious who you have as number 1. But at number 2 for me, it was a real easy one. It's Jimbo Fisher. I really think that Dabo felt like he was going to have his breakthrough moments for this program and get to that national title level 2 seasons before it actually happened, right? And if you remember when Jameis Winston came in to Death Valley, we won't talk about that game for very long. I think that was a pivotal moment and a frustration moment, right, for the Clemson team and for Clemson Nation, because you kind of felt like, hey, this is when we're finally going to catch up with FSU and get past them. Then you turn around into Deshaun Watson's next year with Jameis being suspended for the game. And you talk about, let's have 10 things that could never go wrong in a game, all go wrong in one game, and then barely lose it. That was that game. So I look back at those 2 Clemson FSU games as being some of the most frustrating ones for Clemson Nation and for Dabo during that time, because Dabo saw very early on what he thought that he could build. And I think that he felt like he had built it to that point. I mean, Florida State comes in and blasts Clemson at Death Valley. They go on to win a national title that year. They barely squeak by Clemson down at Joe Campbell. They make the college football playoffs that year. I feel like Dabo thought that he could have been in those positions both of those years. And if they'd have beaten Florida State, they may very well have been in both of those instances. So I put him as number 2. And I'm going to go ahead and do my number 1 because I got to hear who your number 1 is. Can I do that?
All right, go ahead.
Number 1, it's very easy. And I see what you're saying, and I know why you did it the way you did. Steve Spurrier. And don't forget, you bookended. It was 5-2 against Steve. Remember, Dabo beat Steve Spurrier as an enemy.
Yeah, you're right.
And that really kind of, I think, solidified him as the coach. So thank goodness that one happened. Then, of course, the 5 years we don't talk about, and then the win on the backside. So Steve Spurrier also in the media, he and Dabo went at it a couple of times. And I feel like early in Dabo's career, not backing down. And again, was it manufactured? Maybe some of it was. I'd like to think that it was, spur of the moment, no pun intended. When he and Spurrier went back and forth a couple of times in the media, he was very there. And I almost put Rob Spence on there just because that had to be frustrating for Dabo as becoming the interim, they having to fire Rob. I didn't put him on there. But I'm very curious, who is your number one? If it's not Spurrier, who is it? I can't even fathom who you've got. So who have you got?
This is a guy that frustrated me because he's actually been, if you really look at it, he's been a key component for the other coaches beating Clemson. All right. He was a key component for Florida State destroying Clemson. All right. He was a key component.
I think
he was a key component for Georgia but Georgia beating Clemson.
Yep.
And then, miraculously, on a third team, was a key component for beating Clemson at Alabama. And I really looked at that and I thought, man, that is an amazing common denominator that a specific defensive coordinator in Jeremy Pruitt, not a head coach, okay? Not a head coach.
Well, he is now, but he wasn't then.
Yeah, he is now. He wasn't a head coach at the time, and we might not see him against Tennessee. And I don't know how good he is as a head coach. But man, he's basically 3-1 against Dabo if you give him the record.
Yeah.
And what coach do you know has a winning record against Dabo? Really? I mean, I don't know.
Spurrier just about is it.
Yeah.
And, Paul Feinbaum said this week that he felt like, again, there's a different excuse every week coming out of SEC Nation about why Alabama should have beaten Clemson. But he said on his show this week, if Jeremy Pruitt were still defensive coordinator, then Alabama would have beaten Clemson this past year. So evidently he felt like 29 points would appear or disappear out of midair if Jeremy Pruitt had still been on staff for Nick Saban. So a little more credence to why you picked him number one. Good call.
Yeah, so that was my thought is, you have to be some sort of, you have to know something about what works against Clemson to be able to jump to different personnels, different uniforms, different stadiums, different parts of the season, different atmospheres, different seasons, and be under a different head coach every time, but be able to master some sort of plan to beat Clemson. I think that somebody's funneling Pruitt a playbook.